On this edition of Independent Sources, the homeless redesign, the city's effort to curb that escalating population.
In the mayor's affordable housing development plan, about 8% of that development is aimed at low-income New Yorkers. And of course, that's not enough if we want to reduce the homeless population.
And breaking out of the bubble, a fledgling website gives readers new perspective on international news.
We don't just aggregate international stories and translate them. We provide more because we have editors in the country where the story is from telling us why this is a story.
Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Gary Pierre. New York City's homeless crisis is very much an ongoing issue. The number of New Yorkers living in shelters has shot up 70% in the last decade. Just last year, more than 116,000 people entered the city's shelter system. Mayor Bill de Blasio has begun the redesign of the homeless system by launching multiple programs that have helped shrink the family homeless number in the last 2 months. Sarah Pizon spoke with Jared Murphy, editor and publisher of City Limits, and William S. Burnett, a board member of Picture the Homeless, about the recent policy changes.
William, Jared, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
William, what has contributed to the rising number of homelessness in New York City?
Housing costs keep going up, even under Bloomberg's new housing marketplace, where he built affordable houses not aimed at lower-income New Yorkers. So people just can't afford to live in housing. I know more recently, Bloomberg had Housing Stability Plus, an advantage that he was directing shelter clients to, but obviously those were not workable programs, and Advantage ended up being defunded. So I know a lot of people that we deal with at Picture the Homeless who have been on those voucher programs, and obviously they're back in shelters. So
okay, yeah, Jared, I wanted to discuss the Bloomberg era policies. Why didn't those programs work? Why were they so criticized?
I think there were two different kinds of criticism of the Bloomberg era. One was the program specifically designed to attack homelessness. Tended to have as kind of their premise the idea that if you created a benefit, people who weren't deserving of it would come and take it. People would take advantage of it. So everything was kind of designed with that in mind. William mentioned Housing Stability Plus, which was one of the early programs for moving people out of shelter into housing that had a lot of criteria, a lot of time limits. The city has a resource in public housing. It has a resource in Section 8. The Bloomberg administration cut the longstanding link between shelters and those programs. So that was one problem. The other was that other Bloomberg-era policies around development and housing contributed to this rise in rent, and that's the main thing that feeds homelessness. It's not that people have mental illness. It's not that there's substance abuse. That's part of it. But it largely is about evictions and people simply being unable to afford to live in the city, and I think a lot of Bloomberg programs are blamed for, if not inspiring that problem, certainly exacerbating it.
Right, but again, with the new housing marketplace, the housing stock that he was building up, he was building in neighborhoods where his new affordable housing cost more than the housing that was already there, pushing up that rent.
I know that there was also time-limited rental subsidies. What are the problems with that, William?
Under Bloomberg? Well, Housing Stability Plus initially required folks to be on public assistance to get it. And you had to remain on public assistance, and it was a 5-year program that decreased in value 20% each year. And of course, public assistance wasn't going to increase in value, so it was designed from the outset to fail, and it was replaced with the Advantage programs that fully funded the vouchers over the course of its time, but then it was limited to 2 years. With the assumption that folks were going to have a dramatic increase in income at the end of those vouchers.
And that's the root problem with those, is that assumption that after a 2-year period, 5-year period, whatever you want to set the clock to, that people are suddenly going to be able to be earning enough money to afford a market rent. And that's the kind of basic sort of premise that kind of, I think, undermines those programs. And now we have The de Blasio administration has something called the Link NYC programs. There are actually, I think, 5 different kind of branches of that. And while they're very different in many ways, they do kind of operate on the same principle that there will be I think they're time limited programs. Yeah,
like 5-year.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, which is obviously better than 2 years. The Advantage program was only 2 years in the end, and so it's better to have the longer time horizon, certainly to get people to a place where perhaps they would be earning enough. But I think the fact that one of the discussions with affordable housing writ large, whether it's for homeless people or anybody else, is it truly permanent? I mean, one of the contributors to the larger crisis now in the city is a lot of affordable housing is actually coming to the end of its contract, the end of its 25, 30-year, 40-year contract, and kind of what happens then to make sure that the subsidies the city has put into it result in long-term affordability.
The other thing is that the program assumes goodwill and good faith on the part of the landlords, both to enter into the program and sustaining or continuing to house these tenants. And it's a dangerous assumption, I think. We want the city to help reduce homelessness, to assume that those who are in the business of making money off of renting property to people would be responding to the voucher program in good faith.
So what is, so Jared, I'll ask you this question. What are the recent changes in the de Blasio administration? What are some changes that are doing good, I guess?
There have been a few. I mean, one of the reasons why homeless numbers in the shelters went up during the first year de Blasio was mayor is, it's my understanding, that the shelter system began allowing more people in. They were less sort of discriminating at the front door, probably abiding more closely to the idea that people have a basic right to housing in New York. So that's one thing they've done. They also did shut down, at least for families, 2 of the more notorious shelters that were featured in that famous New York Times Dasani series about the homeless girl and her family. But now we're seeing the deeper changes take effect. These are basically the Link NYC programs and reestablishing some connection between shelters and public housing. The number of public housing apartments that de Blasio has put into play for that is far less than advocates would like, but he has at least reopened that link, which, as I mentioned, was closed during the Bloomberg years.
But that link, is it just delaying people's return to shelters, or?
Well, I think that's the $750 million question exactly, is whether this will put people in a place where they can stay out of shelters and avoid the churn. And some of the programs that de Blasio has put in place, the reason that there are like 5 different links is one of them is specifically to target people who are what they call shelter recidivists. I mean, they've had several stays, because that suggests there's something going on that they need some extra help with. And at least ostensibly, that program is supposed to have some other services in place besides just the housing itself to identify those issues and, I guess, ideally help people work through them.
Well, I read that there was a recent report that depicted the city's homeless shelters as being really unsafe and unhealthy for families. So can the mayor increase the availability of NYCHA apartments for, I guess, homeless families?
As apartments?
Yeah.
I would hope so. I wanted to clarify because, we do have the practice of landlords using rent-stabilized and rent-controlled apartments as shelters instead of apartments. So we'd like to see the landlords, and Picture the Homeless is actually working with Jumaane Williams to craft legislation around not allowing rent-stabilized and rent-controlled apartments to be used as shelters.
Right.
And then to allow immediate tenancy for the folks that are staying in those apartments. Instead of being shelter clients, they would be tenants in the rent-stabilized and rent-controlled buildings. Well, I think it would be a stronger approach than relying on the market. And again, I'm not overly critical of the mayor. He has to use the tools that are available to him. But if we could use, NYCHA is publicly owned housing, and we'd have greater public control over the stability of that housing than we would over relying on the goodwill of the private landlords.
Is that something you're advocating for?
Well, Picture the Homeless is advocating around community land trust to have nonprofit possession of land that when property is developed or occupied, we can pressure the developers and the landlords to keep housing costs down and build up responsive to the local community. That's our advocacy.
Right. And Jared, what are you hoping in terms of policy change for, is the homeless?
The interesting question for me is, you mentioned NYCHA. Every year in NYCHA, which, as you know, has its own problems, its own fiscal problems, very serious ones. But 5,000 to 6,000 apartments turn over. And the question is, how many of those do you reserve people coming out of the shelter system? Right now, it's, I think, 750. Advocates asked for 1,500. What the administration tells me is, look, everyone wants to have a piece of NYCHA. There are all these populations that want, some share of those apartments. They feel like they have to kind of divide that pie. But it is interesting, as we talk about spending, I think it's $41 billion total on the mayor's 10-year housing plan. 8 of it or something from the city's own coffers. We have in place this, 60, 70-year-old resource of public housing, and how best to use that, I think, is one of the chief questions. Because, as I said, one of the problems with the market-based affordable housing is it'll be affordable to a certain point, and then the owners are going to want more money or want to take it market. And we don't want to kind of kick this issue down the road to our, children and grandchildren, which ultimately will happen if we have those time limits in place.
Great.
Right. And I'll just add that in the mayor's housing development plan, or affordable housing development plan, about 8% of that development is aimed at low-income New Yorkers. And of course, that's not enough if we want to reduce the homeless population.
Right.
We have a lot of service sector workers in New York who, based on that income, need cheaper apartments.
Right.
So we feel that a much larger portion of the mayor's plan should be dedicated to low-income New Yorkers.
Great. Well, William, Jared, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Still to come on the show, shining a light on the criminal justice system. Before that, Sarah Pizon and Zyphus Laverne have some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Every week we ask you to tell us what's happening in your community, and here's a look at what we gathered. Abby's out today, so Zyphus is filling in for her. Z, what's trending?
Thanks, Sarah. A long-time movement to end the trying of teens as adults is finally gaining ground with the provision's recent addition to the State Assembly's budget proposal. If approved, this reform could take effect in 2018 and would start by changing jurisdiction from criminal to family court. What that means is that juvenile delinquents would be moved to rehabilitation centers, not jail, after they've been arrested.
Wow, so how many minors are we looking at exactly?
So right now there are about 800 minors in the system, all right? And about a third of those are African American and Hispanics. And what's happening is that about close to 80% of those guys are responsible for violent felonies. Yeah.
Wow, so why has it taken so long for the movement to gain momentum?
So what it is, it's a matter of fundings on the state level, and also a bit of resistance from the legislation, because a lot of legislators feel that these crimes are very violent, and so they don't want these minors getting off, if you will, with lenient penalties.
Yeah, that's a fair concern. I guess we'll stay tuned.
Absolutely, we'll keep an eye on that story.
Great. A year-old investigation has led to a big discovery. 5 of the city's largest fuel oil companies have scanned the NYPD, the FDNY, and some of the largest developers of the city in a multi-million-dollar scheme.
No way, that's crazy. What happened?
So they're involved in what's called a blending scheme. So what they do is they take dangerous waste oil, mix it with regular fuel oil, and basically deliver that diluted substance to the customers. They're also rigging meters on their trucks, so they're pretending they're delivering more fuel than they actually are.
No, that can't be. That's like a lot of chicanery. I mean, how is that being addressed right now?
So the Manhattan District Attorney's Rackets Bureau, the NYPD's Organized Crime and Control Bureau, and the city's Office of Business Integrity have raided the companies. They've taken trucks, electronic equipment, and files. And so far, no arrests have been made, and no ties to the mob have been found.
Oh, boy. Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that one for sure.
Yeah.
See what happens. Heather Has Two Mommies is a children's book that sparked national debate when it was published in the 1990s. The American Library Association ranked it the 9th most challenged book of its decade. Today, the author, Leslie Newman, is celebrating the book's 25th anniversary with a makeover.
Wow, so what's new in the book?
Well, there's a lot more text in the book now, and there's a lot more pictures, many more pictures. And one of the most important pictures that's been added is that of the rings, the matching bands on Heather's mommy's hands.
Oh, right, because same-sex marriage wasn't legal back
Yeah,
then.
right? So when she tried to publish the book back in 1989, over 50 publishers, 50 of them, denied her. And so what she eventually had to do was that she had to figure out a way to do it on her own. And now she's got Powerhouse Publishing behind her, which is a much bigger publisher. And they've really been able to help her push the book and get the book out there more than ever before.
That's really great. We should bring her in.
We should definitely have her in. I would love to hear a little more about her story.
Cool. If you like French food as much as I do, then this next story will make you very happy. A massive new French market is saying bonjour to Battery Park City's Brookfield Place in Lower Manhattan.
That sounds so amazing. What's on the menu down there?
So many things. It's literally a huge place, 30,000 square feet of French food. You've got stations, a variety of them, having, they have crepes and pastries and charcuterie and meats and cheeses. I mean, it's the dream.
Oh my God, you're talking my language. We all know how I like a little pastry, right?
Right, absolutely. So do I. And actually, in May, they're going to open up their outdoor section, which will have 7,000 square feet of outdoor space overlooking the Hudson River. So you can go out there and grab a little cafe au lait, maybe a pastry.
So that's great. And Gary's a big Francophile too, so he'd love to go down there with us, maybe get some of that good stuff they got down there.
That sounds really good.
All right, so that's it for us this week. Be sure to tweet us at IndieSources, #Abby and Sarah.
And tell us what's buzzing in your community.
Thanks for staying tuned. The Marshall Project is a website that seeks to expose the inequities in this country's criminal justice system. The former Wall Street Journal reporter and Wall Street analyst Neil Barsky launched the site in November 2014. The site gets its name from the first black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall's fight to exonerate 4 black men of the rape of a 17-year-old white woman in 1949 partially inspired Barsky to take on this project. I spoke to one of the site's staff writers, Dana Goldstein, about what they're doing at the Marshall Project and some of the stories she's covered. Dana, tell us about the Marshall Project.
Sure. We are a nonprofit newsroom covering criminal justice. We're national. We don't specifically cover one geographic area, and we have launched since November 15th, but we've existed for about a year. And we're edited by Bill Keller, the former executive editor of the New York Times.
My old boss.
Yeah.
So why was it necessary to have a site covering criminal justice issues exclusively?
Yeah, well, Neil Barsky is our founder, and he's a former journalist who then went into hedge funds, and he started this as a philanthropic project. And one of the things that Neil noticed and that he brought on Bill to work with him on was that a lot of local newspapers, as they were reducing their staff sizes, as advertising dollars were going down, they were cutting the really in-depth investigative type coverage of a lot of topics, and criminal justice was one of them. It's interesting for me, I used to be an education beat reporter, and that was traditionally thought of as an entry-level beat. You might cover schools for a few years, and then you would prefer to cover City Hall. And criminal justice is a little bit the same. I mean, there's the idea that you start out covering cops, and then you move on. But one of the things that happens is that you don't have people really building the expertise and committing as much time to really dig in deeply. And although there's great people doing it all over the country, we thought there could be more of it. And that's one of the reasons why the Marshall Project got started, to really focus laser sharply on this system it's huge. We are incarcerating probably way too many people. The conditions are quite inhumane. And there's a big need for good journalism on this.
Sure, certainly, and especially since crime and criminal justice intersects between race and class.
Yes.
And you've done a lot of stories about it, and there's you've done, bunch of stories, but your most recent stories, one I wanted you to talk about is the one about Tool to Commit Crime, which caught my attention. Talk to us about that particular story.
So this was a project, really a short essay that we worked on in partnership with the New York Times, but what got me started thinking about this was that, of course, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is on trial facing the death penalty for the Boston Marathon bombing, but if you compare him to Anders Breivik, who you may not recall, but he was the young man who killed over 70 people in Oslo in 2011 in that terrible right-wing extremist terrorist attack. Now, he was just sentenced to 21 years in prison. So on one hand, we have a young male terrorist in the United States facing life in prison or the death penalty. And then in Norway, they're saying, a 21-year sentence is the maximum sentence for the most horrific crime that we have available in our society. And so I wanted to look at a proposal that came from a guy named Mark Maurer. He has put out the idea that a 20-year maximum sentence would make sense in the United States as well. And of course, it sounds very radical to us. If you take away many people's lives, if you perform an act of mass terrorism, I think our assumption is that it would be rather humane for us to not give him the death penalty. But what Mr. Maurer actually argues is that there's a large body of social scientific research that shows that it's really young people that tend to commit violent acts. It really doesn't necessarily make sense to incarcerate someone who's 60 years old, 70 years old for something that they did when they were 18, 19. So I looked at the research that criminologists have done, what we know about brain development, and we see that the peak age for arrest for murder is 19. For rape, it's 18. For some crimes like vandalism, it's as young as 16. So when you start thinking about what our prison system is, it's taking folks who made mistakes basically in their teen years or their very early 20s, and more over the past 2 decades, we've held them into middle age and beyond at great cost, great financial cost to our society, and I think we should question that.
Okay, good. You mentioned about race. We talked about race, and you have a piece on that where it's called Black Boy, White Boy.
Yeah.
Talk to us more about that.
So this was based on a study of the juvenile court system in Florida, and it found that black boys and white boys who had committed the same juvenile offenses, had the same track records in terms of past offending and behavior in school, when they came into the justice system, they had very different outcomes. So unsurprisingly, given what we know about racism in the system, the black boys were more likely to be incarcerated. But something that was surprising about the piece is that they were also more likely than the white boys to just walk away with no consequence or treatment at all. So sometimes the judge...
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so sometimes the judge would see the African-American juvenile and just say, you can go, it's your first offense, you can just go home. But if you actually look at evidence and risk assessments of youth, sometimes what that child needs on their first contact with the court system is something like a drug addiction program. They need therapeutic counseling. They need educational services. And the white boys were more likely to be referred out of court to services. And I think, one of the researchers' thoughts was that perhaps the judges assumed that the black child was less able to take advantage. Maybe they didn't have the support from home. That was the assumption of the judge. But of course, it's incredibly troubling because those are the sorts of services that if we give teenagers the first time they commit a crime, it means they're less likely to do so again in the future.
In your experience with the Marshall Project, how much does class play in the criminal justice system?
Huge.
How much of a role?
Huge. I mean, it's just as important of a factor as race, and of course, they move alongside one another and act in similar ways.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, everything we know about poverty shows that it just makes you much more likely to commit crime, and then once you're in the justice system, you're going to have disproportionately harsh treatment. And that's very, very clear. And when you look at something like the Robert Durst case, which is so much in the news, you can see how money leads to a different outcome. This is a man who was accused of murdering 3 people. He admitted to one of the killings, but by spending $1.3 million on his defense, he was able to have a very vigorous defense. And I mean, I'm the sort of person who believes everybody deserves a defense that rigorous. But of course, we have a system in which our public defenders are incredibly just overworked. And it's not that they're not great at what they do and incredibly well-meaning, but with the caseloads that they have, the typical person that comes through the system has nothing close to a vigorous, rigorous defense.
All right, well, we have to rest the conversation right here. Dana Goldstein, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
When we come back, getting readers to break out of their news bubble. Finally from us, Ristina Burns is a Bulgarian immigrant at the heart of a fledgling website called Pia Today. The site's trying to give readers a new perspective on international news, sometimes pertinent, others perky. Here she is telling us about the site in her own words.
Pangea was the name of the world when it was just one continent before it broke down to a few. And that's our idea. We would just want to bring people together with our site where they can read news stories about every country, just about. and feel like it's their own. Rich Baum is the person who came up with the whole idea of having such a site. He thought it would be a great idea if people who don't speak a foreign language or the language of that country to be able to have access to the local media, because if you want real news, you would generally go to local media. Our target audience is, like I said, news enthusiasts, news junkies. That would probably be like, when I imagine it, that's like 20, 35-year-old people living in the United States. Could be foreigners as well, expats, who would like to stay in touch with what's happening in their countries or other countries where they don't know the language. Just want to know what's around them, want to break out of their bubble. Breaking out of your bubble, to me, it just means you learn something new every day about a place you've never been, and you may never even visit, but you are sort of becoming an expert. Well, that's an expert is like obviously an exaggeration, but you're sort of becoming an expert about a place that people don't know. We don't just aggregate international stories and translate them. We provide more because we have editors in the country where the story is from telling us why this is a story, whether it really is a story, and what's the background information, what's really the context there. One of our most popular stories was about a monorail going through a building in China. Imagine how that would look on a picture. The biggest challenge to me doing this job is making sure that a story is actually true, that it's factually correct. It's not so difficult with stories coming from Latin America because the language is not so different. You know, it's a Latin language. So even with Google Translate, you can still pretty much figure out that, okay, this is actually the story. The editor didn't interpret it wrong. You can do a little Google search or other kinds of search to make sure that it's correct. But when a story is coming from Sri Lanka or China or a place where the language is so different, it's just, it takes a while to make sure that the story is right. I've killed, so to speak, so many stories that I absolutely loved, but I'm like, this doesn't make a lot of sense and I can't verify it, so too bad. So that's just the biggest challenge.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.